2 years ago, my son told me I was not welcome in his home, and those words still cut me deeper than any knife ever could. I remember it vividly, the chill of the evening air clinging to my skin as I stood at his doorway, holding the small box of tools I had carried over to help him repair a broken fence. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. He opened the door just enough for me to see the impatience already etched on his face, his eyes colder than I had ever seen. I thought perhaps he was having a bad day, that maybe stress had hardened his tone, but then he said it straight to me without hesitation, without shame, without even lowering his voice. "You're not welcome here, Dad." The sound of it froze me in place, each word landing like a hammer on the years I had spent breaking my back to give him a good life. For a moment, I stood there, staring at him, searching for some sign that it was a mistake, that he would take it back, but instead he crossed his arms as if daring me to argue. The weight of everything I had done for him pressed against my chest. The sleepless nights, the sacrifices, the dreams I had given up so he could chase his own. And all of it ended in that doorway, with his cold dismissal, with the quiet slam of the door shutting me out. I walked back to my car with the box of tools still in my hands, but it felt heavier than any burden I had ever carried. Because it was not wood or steel pressing down on me, it was the crushing truth that my own son believed I was a nuisance to be discarded. That night, as I sat alone in the house I had built with my own hands, the silence seemed to echo his words again and again. 2 years have passed since that moment, but I can still feel the sting as sharply as the night it happened. Little did he know that the father he cast aside would one day become the man who would decide whether he would ever find shelter again. I remember the last visit as if it were carved into stone, a moment that replays in my mind with relentless clarity, every detail etched in perfect cruelty. It was late afternoon when I drove over to his house, the sky still bright but already carrying that faint chill of dusk, the kind of cold that seems to seep into the bones long before the night has even arrived. I carried a small box of tools in my hand, nothing heavy, just a few essentials, because he had asked if I could help mend a loose panel in the fence that bordered his backyard. I thought it was another chance to show my usefulness, to bridge the widening distance between us, to remind him that even as the years weighed on me, I was still willing to help, still willing to give. When I reached his doorstep, the neighborhood seemed unnaturally quiet, only the sound of my own breathing filling the air. I knocked once, then twice, and when the door opened, I was met not with warmth or gratitude, but with a stare as cold and sharp as broken glass. He stood there, my son, the boy I had raised through sickness and sleepless nights, the boy whose every step into adulthood I had supported with the strength of my hands and the thinning of my wallet. Yet in that moment he was no boy, no son, no grateful child, but a man hardened with arrogance and dismissiveness. His voice was calm, almost too calm, and that made it worse because it carried no hesitation, no flicker of doubt. "You're not welcome here, Dad." 4 words, spoken so simply, so casually, as though he were telling me the time of day. They hit me harder than any shouted insult ever could, because there was no anger to blame it on, no heat of the moment excuse. He meant it. My grip on the toolbox faltered, and for a second I thought I might drop it, but I held on because dropping it would have shown him just how deeply those words had cut. I opened my mouth to respond, to ask why, to plead perhaps, but nothing came out. My throat had locked tight, strangled by the shock. He shifted his stance, crossed his arms, and the look on his face told me that this was not something he would take back. Behind him I could see the dim light of his hallway, the home he shared with his wife and children, the home that I had helped him build indirectly by giving up everything to make his start in life easier. Yet that warmth, that family, was now hidden from me, and all I was allowed to see was the shadowed outline of a life I was no longer part of. The silence after his words was heavier than any shouting match could have been. He did not invite me in, he did not soften, he only waited as if daring me to defy him. So I turned, the box of tools pressing against my fingers, the weight of humiliation pressing against my chest, and walked back down the path toward my car. The door closed behind me with a finality that still rings in my ears, a door slamming not just on a house but on years of sacrifice, love, and loyalty. That was the last visit. That was the moment I became an outsider in my own son's world. I spent my entire life carving out a future for my son, every decision bending around his needs, every sacrifice made with him in mind. And now, when I look back, it feels like a ledger filled only with withdrawals from my soul, nothing ever deposited in return. I remember the long nights at the factory, the relentless grind of machines echoing in my ears, the sting of sweat dripping into my eyes as I pushed myself through double shifts because tuition was due, and I would rather destroy my body than let my boy go without an education. I remember watching other men spend their evenings at home, laughing with their families, while I stood beneath harsh fluorescent lights, my hands raw from labor, convincing myself that all of it would mean something one day, that he would understand the price I had paid. When he was young, I gave up opportunities I had barely even allowed myself to dream about, small luxuries like a newer car or a holiday trip, because every extra cent went into his future. Shoes for his first school year, books that carried him through high school, every bit of it was funded by the hours I traded away from my own life. When college came, I took on loans in my own name so he would not have to start his adult life in debt, and when the tuition bills arrived, I worked through weekends, my body aching in silence, hiding the exhaustion from him so he would never know how close I was to breaking. I told myself over and over that it was worth it, that a father's duty was to build a stronger foundation for his child, even if it meant crumbling under the weight myself. Then came the years when he wanted to start his career, when doors did not open as easily as he thought they would, and it was me once again who pulled strings, who gave him the down payment for his first apartment so he could live closer to opportunities, who co-signed for his first loan because the bank would not trust someone with no credit history. I even dipped into the savings I had tucked away from my retirement just to keep him afloat when he overreached on a car he could not afford but insisted he needed for appearances. I told myself each time that this was the last time, that he would learn, that he would grow, but each time he asked again, and each time I gave, because the thought of him struggling clawed at me more than the thought of my own hunger or exhaustion. I can see now how my generosity blinded me, how my sacrifices only fed his sense of entitlement, but back then I only knew the love of a father who believed his child's success was worth any personal ruin. My life was a series of closed doors for myself. Also his could remain open, and in return, 2 years ago, he slammed one in my face. The first signs of his entitlement were small enough that I ignored them, brushing them aside as youthful arrogance, the kind I thought time and responsibility would temper, but instead they grew like weeds, choking out any trace of humility or gratitude. I remember the way he used to roll his eyes when I gave advice, dismissing my words as if decades of struggle and sacrifice carried no weight compared to his half-formed opinions. He would sigh in impatience when I tried to explain how hard I had worked to put him through school, muttering that it was my job anyway, as though parenthood were nothing more than servitude. When he married, his wife quickly fell into the same pattern, treating me less like family and more like a safety net they could pull from whenever their reckless spending caught up with them. There was no request phrased with respect, only demands dressed up as expectations. They wanted money for a bigger apartment, so I handed over what I had saved for repairs on my own house. They wanted a better car, so I co-signed on a loan I knew they would never manage responsibly. Each time I gave, they grew bolder, acting as though it was their right, as though my years of work were meant to feed their endless hunger for more. I can still hear the tone of his voice, sharp and arrogant, when he once told me that I should be proud to contribute to their lifestyle because it made them look successful, as though appearances mattered more than the truth of their debts. At family gatherings, the disrespect bled into small humiliations, subtle digs about my old clothes, about how I drove the same car year after year, about how I lived in the same modest house instead of upgrading. They laughed at the very sacrifices that had allowed them to rise above struggle, forgetting or refusing to acknowledge that their so-called success was built on my back. What stung the most was the absence of gratitude. Never once did he look me in the eye and say thank you. Never once did his wife acknowledge the strain it put on me to keep them afloat. Instead, they acted as though I owed it to them, as though my entire existence was meant to fund their comforts. When I grew tired and hesitated, even for a moment, his voice would harden, carrying that sharp edge of entitlement, reminding me of how much I had already given, as if that were proof that I should never stop. I see now that they never viewed me as a father to be loved, only as a resource to be drained. Each new demand chipped away at my patience. Each ungrateful glance twisted the knife deeper, until finally, the day he told me I was not welcome in his home, I realized the entitlement had consumed him entirely. What once was arrogance had become something darker, something poisonous, and I had been feeding it for years without knowing. My house is not large or extravagant, but every inch of it carries the weight of my labor, every nail driven into its frame, a testament to the years I spent building something solid out of very little. I started on this plot of land when I was younger and stronger, pouring concrete by hand for the foundation, cutting lumber in the biting cold, and working long evenings after my shifts to raise walls that would one day shelter my family. The wood beams still bear the marks of my calloused hands, and when I walk through the halls, I can feel the echo of my younger self, driven by determination, swinging a hammer under dim lights with nothing but grit to guide me. The walls are simple, the paint modest, but each brush stroke was mine, each tile in the floor set carefully by my own patience, and when storms rage outside, I take comfort in knowing it was my effort that made this place stand strong. The kitchen where I spent countless hours preparing meals for my son, the living room where he once played on the rug with toys I had saved months to afford, the bedroom where I collapsed after long shifts with my back screaming in pain, all of it is layered with memories that tell the story of sacrifice and endurance. There were times I thought about selling it, about moving to something easier, something newer, but I never could. Because this house is more than walls and a roof. It is proof that my sweat built something permanent in a world that takes so much away. When I sit on the porch in the evenings and watch the sun dip behind the trees, I feel a quiet pride that no betrayal can erase, because this home is mine in a way nothing else ever has been. It does not judge me. It does not turn me away. It does not measure my worth against what I can provide. It simply stands, a silent companion to my struggles. After my son shut me out of his own home, After he slammed that door and left me standing in humiliation, I returned here, and for the first time in years I saw this place not just as shelter, but as sanctuary. Its silence was not cold but protective, its sturdiness a reminder that I was not weak, that I had built something lasting even if my own blood turned his back on me. This house became my fortress, the one place he could not strip from me, the one thing his arrogance could not tarnish. When I run my hand along the grain of the wooden banister, I know it will outlast the cruelty of his words. This home holds me, guards me, and reminds me that while people can betray, the things built with true labor and sacrifice endure. It is my monument, my refuge, and the one place I know I will never be unwelcome. The silence of estrangement is not an empty silence. It is a silence that presses down like a heavy blanket, suffocating and cold, yet over time it begins to reveal truths that noise would have hidden. For 2 years there were no visits, no phone calls, not even a card at holidays or a half-hearted message on my birthday. The son I had given everything for, the family I had supported beyond reason, acted as if I had vanished from existence, and in a way I had. At first I sat by the phone, convincing myself it might ring, that perhaps he would feel regret in the quiet hours of his own nights. But days became weeks and weeks became months, and the phone remained still, its silence mocking me. The first year was the hardest. The weight of loneliness gnawed at me. The house felt too large, every room echoing with memories of laughter that no longer returned, every corner reminding me of sacrifices made for people who now pretended I did not exist. I would catch myself setting an extra plate at the table out of habit, only to put it back in the cabinet with a lump in my throat. The second year felt different, not lighter, but sharper, clearer, because by then I stopped expecting kindness from people who had already shown me who they were. The silence became a mirror, reflecting their true character back at me. A son who could erase his father so completely, who could teach his children that their grandfather was disposable, was not a son who had been misled by a moment of anger. No, this was deliberate. This was arrogance turned into neglect, entitlement transformed into cruelty. Each day that passed without a word was proof that I had never been seen as family, only as a resource to be tapped, and once that well was closed, so too was any pretense of care. There is a strange kind of freedom in that realization, painful but liberating. Because once you accept that someone never truly valued you, their absence becomes less of a wound and more of a cure. The loneliness still aches. Of course it does, but it also hardens, teaching me to stand in the quiet without reaching for people who would rather see me beg. I sit in my home, the one I built with my hands, and in the silence I hear not their laughter but the beating of my own resolve. 2 years without them has shown me that family by blood means nothing without loyalty, that love given without gratitude becomes chains that only bind the giver. They severed those chains when they shut me out, and though it left me alone, it also left me free to see them as they truly are. In that silence, I stopped being a victim of their demands and began to become something else, something colder, something ready. It was on a quiet morning when the phone rang, the sound startling in its suddenness after so many months of silence. And when I looked at the screen and saw his name, I felt a strange mix of emotions rise in me all at once. Disbelief, anger, and something colder that settled quickly beneath the surface. For 2 years that phone had remained empty of his voice, 2 years of birthdays and holidays where his absence spoke louder than any words could, and yet here it was, his number flashing like nothing had happened. I let it ring twice before answering, my hand tight around the receiver, my chest heavy with suspicion, because I knew this could not be a call born out of love or regret. No, my son had made it clear what I meant to him, and men like him do not wake up one morning suddenly grateful. His voice came through the line softer than I remembered, almost too soft, laced with a forced friendliness that made my stomach tighten. "Hey, Dad," he said, pausing as though expecting me to fill the silence with warmth, but I gave him nothing, only a quiet acknowledgement. He cleared his throat and began to speak, weaving small talk into the conversation, asking about my health, about the house, about how I had been holding up, words that felt foreign coming from him after years of absence. I could hear the strain beneath his tone, the way each question was less genuine curiosity and more performance, a script he was forcing himself to read. I listened, saying little, because I wanted to hear the cracks in his voice, the hesitations that betrayed his purpose. And then, after circling the subject like a predator, he finally said what he had called for, that he wanted to come by and talk, his voice wrapping that word in friendliness, but unable to mask the urgency beneath it. Talk. After 2 years of silence, after throwing me out of his life, after shutting me out of his home, now he wanted to talk. The word echoed in my head like a warning bell. My hand tightened around the phone, and my heart steadied into a cold rhythm because I knew my son too well to believe this was reconciliation. There was something he wanted, something he needed, and for the first time in years he had decided to lower himself enough to reach out. I did not agree immediately. I let silence stretch between us until he shifted uncomfortably, repeating his request, his tone a little sharper now, less patient. That change told me everything I needed to know, that this call was not about me, it was about him, about his convenience, his desperation. Suspicion bloomed fully inside me, but I hid it beneath calm words, telling him we could talk soon. As I hung up, the weight of that unexpected call lingered, and though he thought he had taken the first step back into my life, all he had really done was reveal just how far he was about to fall. When he finally came over, walking up the path to the house he had ignored for 2 long years, I could see the unease in his steps, the way his eyes darted across the porch as though the place itself judged him for returning. He tried to wear a smile, a thin mask of casual charm, but it cracked around the edges, and when I opened the door to him, the silence between us was thick with unspoken history. He greeted me with words that felt rehearsed, a strained attempt at warmth, but his voice trembled in a way that betrayed the truth he had come to deliver. We sat at the old wooden table in my kitchen, the one that had stood for decades as meals were shared and lives were discussed, but now it was a stage for a different kind of performance. He began slowly, circling the real issue with shallow pleasantries, complimenting the house, remarking how sturdy it looked, pretending as if he had not once dismissed it as old and outdated. I listened in silence, my hands folded, my face steady, waiting for the curtain to fall and the truth to step out. And then, at last, it came. His voice dropping, his eyes shifting away from mine as he confessed that things had not gone well for him, that his finances had collapsed, that debts had piled up higher than he could climb. His words tumbled out in fragments, excuses woven through admissions, stories of bad luck, of markets turning against him, of responsibilities heavier than he expected. Yet beneath every excuse I could hear the truth, a lifetime of recklessness catching up with him. Then he looked at me, the mask gone now, desperation laid bare, and he asked if he and his family could move into my house for just a while, until things got better. He said it with a practiced humility, but his eyes betrayed the assumption that I would agree, as though after everything he had done, after the silence, after shutting me out, it was natural that I should open my door to him now. The audacity of it struck me like a blow. The bitter irony that the son who had once told me I was not welcome in his home now came crawling to mine, seeking shelter in the very walls he had scorned. And he tried to soften the request by saying it would only be temporary, just until they got back on their feet, but I could hear the hollowness in his words, the lie he told himself as much as me. This was not a man asking for a roof for a week. This was a drowning man clawing for anything that would keep him afloat, no matter who he dragged under in the process. I sat there, silent, the weight of his request pressing against me, but beneath the weight there was no warmth, no sympathy, only the cold certainty that the time for generosity had ended. The moment the words left his mouth, asking if he and his family could move into my house for just a while, I felt a storm rise inside me, a clash between the instinct that had guided me all my life and the bitter knowledge carved into me by his betrayal. For decades, my first reaction had always been to provide, to fix, to sacrifice without hesitation, and I could feel that instinct flicker again like an old flame refusing to die. There was a part of me that remembered the little boy who once ran barefoot across the yard, who clung to my hand when he was afraid, who looked at me with trust and dependence, and that part wanted to shield him again even now. But then, just as quickly, the memory of his cold voice returned, the echo of those 4 words that had shattered me 2 years ago. "You're not welcome here, Dad." I saw him standing at his doorway, arms crossed, shutting me out as though I were nothing more than a beggar, and the instinct to give was smothered beneath the weight of that humiliation. My heart ached with the pull of both forces, the love of a father that had always been stronger than reason, and the pain of a man who had been discarded like an unwanted burden. For a moment I sat frozen, listening to him explain his situation, hearing the desperation in his voice, and I wondered if refusing him would make me as cold as he had once been to me. The thought twisted in my chest, but then something shifted, something final and unyielding. I realized that compassion had been my chain, that generosity had been the tool of my own undoing, and if I yielded now, I would only be confirming what he had always believed, that no matter how deeply he wounded me, I would still come crawling back with open hands. A fire burned in me then, not of anger, but of resolve, a clarity that spread through my mind like ice. I understood in that moment that I had given enough, more than enough, and that to give again would not be love but surrender. He had mistaken my patience for weakness, my sacrifices for obligations, but now I saw the truth clearly. The son I had raised was no longer my responsibility, his failures no longer mine to fix. My instinct to provide fought against this newfound resolve, but this time it lost, crushed beneath the memory of every insult, every demand, every moment of ingratitude. I looked across the table at him, watching his eyes plead for an answer he thought inevitable, and I felt no urge to bend, no desire to ease his burden. For the first time in my life I chose not to be used, not to be manipulated, and in that choice a strange calm settled over me. Something inside me had changed forever. As I sat there with his desperate request still hanging in the air, my mind became a gallery of every insult, every moment of arrogance, every word that had cut into me over the years, and instead of breaking me as they once did, they began to harden into something stronger. I remembered the time he mocked the old car I drove, laughing in front of others that his father looked like a man stuck in another decade. never once acknowledging that it was the same car I used to drive him to school in the dead of winter, the same car I kept running because the money I might have spent on a new one went to his tuition. I remembered the way he dismissed my advice with a smirk, rolling his eyes as though my decades of labor and sacrifice had taught me nothing worth hearing. I remembered the subtle humiliations at family gatherings when he and his wife whispered about how outdated my house was, the same house built with the hands that had built his future. And most of all, I remembered the sharp sting of that day 2 years ago, the final insult, the words that had carved themselves into me like stone. "You're not welcome here, Dad." Each memory rose one after another, not to weaken me, but to forge me. The pain they carried no longer pulled me down. It lifted me into clarity, transforming humiliation into fuel. As I listened to him stumble through excuses for his failure, I understood that this was not my burden to bear, that his collapse was the consequence of the entitlement I had fed for too long. The thought of granting him easy refuge, of opening my doors after all he had done, settled in my chest like poison, and I knew then that I could not do it. To let him in would be to erase the lesson of those years, to dishonor the pain I had endured, to betray myself yet again. My resolve grew colder with every second I studied him across the table, watching the flicker of arrogance still hiding behind his desperation, the assumption that I would fold as I always had. He expected generosity, he expected surrender, but he no longer understood the man sitting before him. That man had been forged by betrayal, remade by silence, strengthened by solitude. In that moment, I decided with absolute certainty that I would grant no easy refuge, not to him, not to the family that had stood by his side in my erasure. This house was my fortress, my monument, and it would never again be sullied by their entitlement. Whatever sympathy tried to creep into me was drowned by the memory of every cruel word, every ungrateful glance, and in its place rose determination. If he had thought me weak before, he would soon learn the depth of my resolve, cold and unyielding as stone. The morning after his request, I woke with a clarity I had not felt in years, a stillness inside me that was not weakness but resolve. And I knew the next step would not be made with emotion but with strategy. I dressed in silence, locking the door of my house behind me, and made my way to the office of a lawyer whose reputation was built on precision and discretion. Sitting across from her, I laid out the story in calm detail, not as a man seeking pity, but as a client demanding protection. She listened without judgment, her pen scratching across the paper as I explained that my son and his family might attempt to move in, that they might even try to claim some imagined right to what I had built. When I placed the deed to my house on her desk, she studied it carefully, then looked me in the eye and told me that there were ways to secure it beyond dispute. With her guidance, I set the process in motion, creating a trust that would place the property out of reach from anyone but me, an iron gate built not of wood or steel but of law. From there I walked to the office of my financial advisor, a man I had known for years, whose sharp eyes missed nothing. I told him I wanted every account reviewed, every investment safeguarded, every line of my will rewritten so that no loophole could be twisted by greedy hands. He nodded as I spoke, tapping at his keyboard, pulling up documents, making sure that what I had worked for could never be siphoned away by those who believed they were entitled to it. Together we structured my assets into layers of protection, accounts that could not be touched without my express consent, instructions in my will that removed all ambiguity. By the time we finished, my life's work was locked away tighter than any vault. Walking out of that office, The weight on my shoulders felt lighter, not because I had forgiven or forgotten, but because I had taken control. For years I had been reactive, giving whenever asked, folding whenever pressured, but now I was deliberate, methodical, and every step was part of a plan. I imagined my son's face when he discovered that what he thought was his safety net had been cut away, that the home he had once scorned and now sought as refuge was no longer within his grasp. The thought did not fill me with joy, but with a grim sense of justice, the kind born not of revenge for its own sake, but of balance finally restored. I returned home that evening, the papers in my hand a shield stronger than anything I had ever built with hammer and nails, and for the first time since his betrayal, I allowed myself to sit in my chair, breathe deeply, and feel peace in the knowledge that the ground had shifted. The fortress was no longer just walls of wood and stone. It was protected by law, by foresight, by my own determination. It did not take long after that first conversation for his mask of politeness to slip away, replaced by the sharp edge of entitlement that had always been his true face. And soon the calls and texts began to pour in like a relentless storm. At first, his messages carried a tone of pleading, little reminders of how family should stick together, appeals wrapped in the language of obligation, as if the years of silence and betrayal could be erased with a few sentimental words. But when I did not respond the way he wanted, when my replies were short and without commitment, the tone shifted quickly. His texts grew longer, more insistent, layering excuses about his financial struggles with subtle barbs aimed at my supposed coldness. "I can't believe you'd let us suffer like this after everything you've done for me," he wrote in one message, twisting my sacrifices into weapons, as though my history of giving obligated me to give again. Then came the voicemails, his voice strained and impatient, demanding that I answer, pressing me to make a decision, and in those recordings I heard the arrogance beneath his desperation. He began to talk about the house in ways that made my blood run cold, hinting that it was only natural he would one day inherit it, speaking as though my home was already his possession waiting to be claimed. "You know this place will be mine eventually," he said in one message, his tone almost casual, but beneath it was the same dismissiveness he had shown me at his doorstep 2 years ago. He no longer asked, he assumed, and in his assumption he revealed just how little he had learned. Each new attempt grew sharper, the words dripping with contempt when persuasion failed. "I don't understand why you're being so stubborn," he sneered in another recording, as though I were the one at fault for not surrendering the roof over my head. His wife even joined in, her name appearing on my phone with messages about how unfair it was to keep the house to myself when they had children who needed space to grow, as though the years of their absence and disrespect meant nothing. The pressure came daily, a barrage of demands cloaked in self-righteousness, and with each message, my resolve only hardened further. He believed persistence would wear me down, that the father who had always given would eventually fold, but what he could not see was that every word only pushed me further from him. In his arrogance, he showed me again and again that he did not see me as a man, as a father, but as an obstacle to be moved or a resource to be claimed. Each voicemail, each entitled declaration became another brick in the wall I was building between us. And as his pressure grew, so too did my determination that he would never cross the threshold of my home. When the day finally came for us to sit face to face, I felt no tremor in my hands, no rush of panic in my chest, only the steady calm of a man who had already made his decision long before the first word was spoken. He arrived with that forced air of confidence he always wore when he thought he was about to get his way, his shoulders squared, his chin raised, but I could see the cracks in his expression, the impatience hiding just behind his eyes. We sat across from one another at the same table where I had listened to his desperate request not long ago, the air between us thick with all the years of sacrifice, betrayal, and silence. He launched quickly into his rehearsed speech, talking about family, about loyalty, about how hard things had been for him and how it was only natural for me to open my doors and tame, as if the 2 years of estrangement and the words he had once spoken at his own doorway had been erased. I let him talk, nodding occasionally, my expression unreadable, until his words began to circle back on themselves, until he leaned in, expecting agreement. Then, with a voice steady and cold, I gave him my answer. I told him, no. No hesitation, no softening, no opening for debate. He blinked, taken aback, as though the word itself were foreign coming from me, as though the father who had given everything could not possibly deny him now. He laughed once, a short bitter sound, then leaned back in his chair, his arrogance rising to the surface like oil on water. "You're really going to let your own family suffer?" He spat, his tone sharp and accusing, the same dismissive cruelty I had heard so many times before. He called me selfish, heartless, accused me of holding on to a house that was too big for me alone, as if the years I had spent building it meant nothing compared to his sudden need. His words grew louder, his face tightening with anger as he demanded to know what kind of father would turn his back on his own son. Through it all, I sat still, my voice calm, reminding him that it was he who had once turned me away, he who had told me I was not welcome in his home. The memory of that moment silenced him for only a heartbeat before his arrogance surged again, dismissing it as the past, insisting that now things were different. But I did not waver. I told him firmly that my home was not his refuge, that his failures were not mine to mend, and that I would no longer be the resource he bled dry. His anger boiled over then, his words sharp and venomous, but none of it touched me. My refusal was final, and though he stormed from my house accusing me of cruelty, I felt only the cold satisfaction of a man who had finally drawn a line that would not be crossed. His anger had not cooled when he came back the next day, storming through my door without waiting for an invitation, his voice already raised, his accusations spilling over like a man desperate to regain control. He shouted about betrayal, about how I had abandoned him, about how unfair it was for me to turn my back when he needed me most, his words cutting the air with the arrogance of a man who believed the world owed him comfort. I let him rant, let him spit his venom until his voice began to strain, and then I spoke, calm and deliberate, every syllable cutting sharper than his shouts. I told him I knew. His face shifted at that, the certainty in his eyes flickering into something closer to fear. I told him I knew about the debts he had buried under false smiles, the gambling nights where he thought no one was watching, the repossessions that had left his accounts bleeding, his mouth opened slightly, but no words came. I told him I knew about the creditors that called his phone until he stopped answering, about the notices piling up at his door, about the quiet collapse of the life he had built on arrogance and borrowed money. His face went pale, the blood draining from him as though my words had stolen the very ground from under his feet. For the first time in years, I saw him without the shield of entitlement, stripped of the illusions he carried, and what stared back at me was not the confident man he wanted the world to see, but the frightened boy he had always been underneath. He stammered, tried to deny it, but his voice cracked, his eyes darting away, searching for a corner of the room that would not accuse him. I leaned forward and reminded him that the world was not blind, that secrets never stayed buried forever, and that he had underestimated me just as he had underestimated every consequence of his recklessness. He had thought me weak, thought my silence meant ignorance, but he was wrong. I had seen the patterns, followed the whispers, pieced together the truth, and now I laid it before him like a mirror he could not escape. His hands tightened into fists, not from strength but from the helplessness of a man whose lies had been peeled away. "You don't know what you're talking about," he muttered, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him, and the silence that followed carried more truth than any denial he could muster. In that moment the balance shifted, the power he had always wielded through arrogance shattered by the knowledge I held. He went pale, his jaw tight, his composure slipping as he realized just how much I knew, just how much I had prepared. For once, it was he who stood exposed, and I who held the strength of silence and truth. I sit in my chair at night, and the irony is almost too sharp to ignore, a cruel twist of fate that would almost be laughable if it were not soaked in the bitterness of memory. 2 years ago, my son stood in his doorway, his arms crossed, his voice cold and final as he told me I was not welcome in his home. I can still feel the sting of those words, the humiliation of turning away with my box of tools, the sound of his door slamming shut as if to seal my exile. He had power then, or at least he thought he did, reveling in the arrogance of shutting out the man who had given him everything. And now, 2 years later, he is the one knocking on doors, not with pride but with desperation, begging to step inside the house that he once mocked as old and outdated, begging to be sheltered by the very walls he once dismissed. The irony of it gnaws at me in quiet moments, the cruel balance of justice showing itself in its own time. I think back to the silence of estrangement, those long months where I heard nothing from him, not a call, not a word, and now the silence has been broken not by love or remorse, but by need. The same lips that once spat rejection now shape themselves into pleas. The same arrogance that cast me aside now twists into entitlement that demands entry. It is as though the house itself, my house, has become a symbol of everything he cannot control, everything he cannot possess, no matter how he claws for it. When I look at these walls, I do not just see the wood and stone I built with my hands. I see my fortress, my sanctuary, the place he told me I could not belong to him, now transformed into the one place he desperately seeks. There is a grim satisfaction in that reversal, a justice that requires no words, no arguments, only the simple fact that the man who once cast me aside now finds himself standing outside my door. The irony is sharper because it was avoidable, because if he had chosen respect instead of arrogance, gratitude instead of entitlement, this house could have been a home for both of us, a legacy shared instead of a fortress defended. Instead, his choices, his cruelty, his betrayal have turned it into a line he cannot cross. 2 years ago, I was the one unwelcome, and now it is he who is unwelcome. And the difference is that my refusal is not born of arrogance but of justice. I see it clearly now, the sting of irony cutting deeper than his words ever could, because in the end, he was the architect of his own exile, and the door he slammed in my face has now been slammed on him by the hand of fate itself. He returned once more, his tone shifting between desperation and simmering rage, his words tangled in half-threats and half-pleas, convinced that if he pressed long enough, I would finally bend. He spoke of his children needing stability, of how unfair it was that I sat alone in a house too big for me. of how family was supposed to help one another in times of struggle. I let him talk, watching the fire in his eyes flicker between arrogance and fear, and when at last he paused to catch his breath, I laid the truth before him with calm precision. I told him the house was no longer mine to give, not in the way he imagined. I explained that the deed had already been placed into a trust designed carefully with the help of professionals, a trust that placed the property beyond the reach of anyone but me. His brow furrowed, his mouth opening as though he had misheard, but I repeated it, slowly, deliberately, making sure every word cut through his assumptions. I told him it did not matter what debts he carried, what creditors hounded him, what illusions he spun for himself. This home was untouchable. He tried to laugh it off at first, a bitter sound filled with denial, but the color drained from his face as the reality sank in, as he realized the safety net he had counted on was gone. His voice rose, demanding to know why I would do such a thing, accusing me of betrayal, of cruelty, as though it was not he who had cast me out 2 years ago, as though it was not he who had treated me as nothing more than a resource. I remained calm, unmoved, telling him that the fortress he saw around him was built not just from wood and stone, but from foresight, from law, from resolve. His words grew frantic, his hands tightening into fists as he accused me of robbing him of his inheritance, of taking away what was rightfully his. I told him with absolute clarity that nothing in this world was rightfully his except what he earned for himself, that the years of entitlement and arrogance had led him here, not my choices but his. The silence that followed was thick, heavy with the collapse of his illusions. For the first time he seemed smaller, deflated, a man stripped of the arrogance that had shielded him for so long. He had believed he could always fall back on me, that no matter how far he sank, I would be there to catch him. But now he knew the truth. The net was cut, the walls were closed, and the fortress stood impregnable. He stared at me then with a mixture of disbelief and fury, and I met his gaze with steady calm, knowing that in that moment the trap had closed completely, leaving him with nothing but the consequences of his own making. The moment the weight of my words sank into him, his face twisted into something ugly, a mask of rage barely concealing the fear that churned beneath. He slammed his hand down on the table, the sound reverberating through the room, and spat venom with every sentence that followed. He called me selfish, bitter, accused me of being a miser who would rather see his own flesh and blood starve than part with a single inch of his comfort. His voice cracked as he hurled insult after insult, words designed to cut deep, calling me a failure as a father, claiming that all my sacrifices had been nothing more than what I owed him. I sat in silence, unmoved, watching the unraveling of a man who had built his life on arrogance and now found the ground stripped from beneath him. The more I stayed calm, the louder he became, his words losing coherence as anger overtook reason, his hands trembling not with strength, but with helplessness. He raged about inheritance, about how one day the house would belong to him anyway, and when I reminded him with quiet firmness that the trust ensured he would never touch it, he went pale again, before his fury returned twice as strong. He stood, knocking his chair backward, his voice rising to a shout as he accused me of betrayal, as if the betrayal had not begun years ago when he cast me aside. His eyes darted wildly, searching for control, for some weapon in his words that could wound me, but he found nothing. Each insult he threw only echoed back against the fortress of my resolve, powerless, hollow. Finally, when his chest heaved with exhaustion and his words dissolved into sputtered curses, he realized there was nothing left to say. He grabbed his coat, his movements jerky, his face flushed with humiliation, and stormed toward the door, his voice breaking one last time as he shouted that I would regret this, that I had ruined any chance of being part of his life again. The irony of that statement hung heavy, for it was he who had cut me out long ago, and now it was he who fled, powerless to undo the consequences of his own arrogance. The door slammed behind him with a violence meant to shake me, but it did not. Instead, the silence that followed felt like victory, not joyous but steady. The silence of a man who had stood his ground and watched the storm break against him without flinching. In that silence, I knew the unraveling was complete. He had lashed out, he had hurled his insults, but he had left with nothing, humiliated and powerless. The son who once told me I was not welcome, now discovering that the same fate awaited him. When the echoes of the slammed door finally faded, I was left alone in the stillness of my home, the same home that had sheltered my sacrifices, my heartbreak, and now my vindication. The quiet pressed in around me, not heavy as it once had been during the long years of estrangement, but light, cleansing, a silence that felt earned. I sat back at the table, my hands resting on the worn wood, and I let my mind drift through the years that had brought me here. I saw the younger man I had once been, shoulders bent under the weight of double shifts, sweat dripping from my brow as I told myself that every ache, every lost hour of sleep, every empty pocket was worth it because it built a better life for my son. I saw the boy I had carried on those tired shoulders, the child I had dressed in shoes I worked overtime to buy, the young man I had pushed through school with money I did not have but found anyway. I thought of the countless times I chose his needs over my own, believing that was what fathers were meant to do, never realizing I was teaching him to take without giving, to expect without gratitude. The betrayal of that day 2 years ago returned to me then, the sting of his voice telling me I was not welcome, and though the pain had once been unbearable, now it felt like a scar, no longer bleeding but forever etched into me, as a reminder of the truth. I had wasted years hoping that my sacrifices would be seen, that my love would be enough to anchor respect, but in the end, I had given to someone who saw me as nothing more than a stepping stone. And yet, as I sat there in the quiet aftermath, I felt no anger rising in me, no desire to chase him down or hurl words back at him. Instead, I felt peace. Cold and steady, the peace of knowing that I had finally stood firm, that I had not bent once more beneath the weight of his arrogance. The house around me seemed to breathe with me, its walls steady, its silence no longer empty but protective, as though it too understood that the storm had passed and the foundation had held. I reflected on the years wasted, yes, but I also realized they were lessons carved into me. Lessons that had led me here to a place of strength I had not thought myself capable of. Alone, I did not feel abandoned. Alone, I felt free. The betrayal had been endured, the storm weathered, and in the stillness of that evening, I understood that peace is not found in forgiveness nor in forgetting, but in standing unyielding when the moment demands it. That peace, at last, was mine. As the hours passed and night settled over the house, I found myself reflecting not on his insults or his anger, but on the strange sense of victory that lingered inside me, a victory far deeper than simply denying him entry. For years I had been a man enslaved by my own generosity, tricked into believing that love was measured by how much I could endure, how much I could give without question, how much I could sacrifice until nothing of myself remained. My son had learned to wield that against me, to manipulate my instinct to provide, twisting it into a weapon that left me drained while he grew arrogant and entitled. But as I sat in my chair and listened to the steady hum of silence filling the rooms, I realized the true victory was not shutting him out of my home. It was proving to myself that I could no longer be used. I had broken the cycle, shattered the chains I had unknowingly forged with every dollar handed over, every demand met, every insult swallowed in the name of peace. This time, I had chosen myself. This time, I had chosen dignity over humiliation, resolve over submission, truth over the endless lies I had been fed. The peace that came with that realization was not loud or triumphant. It was quiet, steady, the kind that settles into the bones and strengthens them from within. I walked the halls of my house that night, running my hand along the walls I had built, and I knew that for the first time in many years, I was not living for someone else's demands, but for my own survival, my own respect. Vindication did not roar, it whispered, and its whisper told me that I was no longer the victim of a manipulative son, but the master of my own fate. I looked out the window into the dark yard and thought of the irony that he had once told me I was unwelcome in his home, and now I had shown him the same truth, only mine carried with it a lesson he could not escape. He would rage. He would curse my name. He would tell himself I was cruel. But in the quiet moments of his own life, he would know the truth that his arrogance had finally met a wall it could not climb. And I would know the truth as well, that I had at last stood tall, that I had chosen not to be broken, and that in that choice I had found a peace no one could take from me. That was the real victory. That was the moment I reclaimed myself. I stand in the doorway of my home as the morning sun spills across the yard, its light brushing against the walls I raised with my own hands, and I feel the weight of finality settle over me like a cloak that fits at last. This house, once mocked as outdated, once dismissed as small and unimpressive by the very son who now begged to be sheltered within it, rises before me not as a mere dwelling but as a monument, a testament to every hour of sweat, every calloused hand, every sacrifice that had shaped both it and me. For years I let his scorn poison the pride I should have felt, believing his words when he laughed at the peeling paint or sneered at the worn steps. But now I see it clearly. What he saw as weakness was in truth strength. What he treated as shame was in truth resilience. The home endured just as I endured, standing through storms, through loneliness, through betrayal, until it became more than shelter. It became proof that nothing he said, nothing he did, could strip from me what I had built. As I look at these walls, I see not just wood and stone, but the embodiment of justice served, for here is where he once thought himself above me, and here is where he came crawling back, desperate and broken, only to find the doors barred by his own past. The irony is sharp, yes, but the satisfaction is steadier, quieter, the kind that lives in the bones rather than in the fleeting rush of triumph. My son's arrogance may have unraveled, his manipulation may have failed, but what stands now is not his ruin but my peace, earned through endurance and secured by resolve. I know he will walk away telling himself he was wronged, telling others I was selfish. But the truth will gnaw at him in the quiet hours when no one is listening. The truth that this house, this fortress, will never belong to him, and that his own words 2 years ago carved the path to this ending. I run my hand along the banister, feeling the grain of the wood, and I know it will outlast the bitterness of betrayal. It will stand long after the memory of his insults fade, because it was built on labor and sacrifice, not entitlement and greed. This home is my legacy, not as something to be handed to those who never respected it, but as proof that I survived, that I endured, that I stood firm when it mattered most. And in that truth, In that monument of resilience, I find the justice that eluded me for so many years. The door is closed now, and it will stay closed, not out of cruelty, but out of strength. This is my house, my sanctuary, my triumph, and no one can take that from me. Your time means a lot. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left.